Sunday where it's a very interesting Sunday to be a preacher. Because you look at the three readings, right? We've got covenant with Abraham. We've got an instruction from Paul to imitate the apostles. And then we've got a teaching about Jesus and prophecy. So, we have three readings, nothing to do with each other. See, usually in the lectionary it's nice. There's a nice unifying theme. Either we're talking about the grace of God, or we're talking about forgiveness, or we're talking about prophecy. But there's very few Sundays in the lectionary that's all over the map, and this happens to be one of them. And so, instead of trying to tie up loose ends and make connections where I can't really see any, I'm just going to concentrate on the gospel for today. Because I think the gospel for today has interesting things to say, both in Jesus' time and in the way that he's speaking to the people, but also for us as a faith community as we make our way towards Easter through these 40 days of Lent. One of the things that struck me as I was looking at this gospel passage is that for some reason the Pharisees are being unpharisaic, right? Normally they like to back Jesus in a corner. Normally they like to try and trip him up and get him in trouble with authority. Here, though, we have some Pharisees that come to Jesus and say, Herod is looking for you, and he wants to kill you. So get up and go, so that you can escape. It's very strange. It doesn't really fit with the whole picture of what we know about the Pharisees, especially in Luke's interpretation. And so I think that in order to understand what's going on and how this passage may be something which speaks to us and also confronts us, is to understand what the real motivation of the Pharisees are. See, because the Pharisees and other folks in authority, they knew that what Jesus was starting to teach and preach and proclaim amongst the peoples was very dangerous. They knew that once Rome got wind of what was being taught and what was catching on fire with these upstarts from the region of Judea, the Roman government would come in. The troops would invade. The temple would likely be destroyed. And in fact, it is destroyed shortly, within 20 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And so, there's a real fear for those who are in power that their power will be lost. So the impression that we get that all of a sudden these Pharisees are being nice to Jesus, suddenly it's revealed that they have their own agenda. And it's not an altogether bad agenda. I don't think any one of us would want somebody to come in and swoop and destroy all of London, Ontario. I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think one of the cornerstones and one of the things that must pause to give us thought is Jesus' response. In response to the option of continuing to proclaim God's grace and God's mercy and God's radical hospitality, or running the other way. Jesus says, you tell Herod, that clever fox, that today, tomorrow, and the next day, I'm going to keep continuing to do what I do best. Casting out demons, curing the sick, proclaiming the good news. And of course, the image of Herod being a fox has a double entendre of sorts. In the Old Testament prophetic literature, the fox is often seen in its imagery as a destructive force. So when we hear about invading armies and destruction and exile, we hear about jackals and foxes and wolves coming and taking the spoils of war. And of course, we also have the more Hellenistic, the more Greek connotation which we are familiar with, that the fox is sly, the fox is clever, the fox likes things to happen under the table where nobody notices. And so, Jesus' response to either to keep teaching and to keep proclaiming or to run is instead to agitate authority. Jesus says, in essence, to the Pharisees, you think what I've been teaching is bad. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to call the Roman authority fox. I'm going to speak out loud the fact that this government that is occupying my territory, my people, is corrupt. And while we may gloss over it in our own readings and in our own interpretations of the scripture, for Jesus to be so assertive and so controversial is a dangerous thing. He's risking his life. He's risking, in essence, the whole city. But he knows that he comes bringing the truth. He comes knowing that he brings healing and reconciliation to the world. He comes knowing that his journey must involve entering the city. It must involve suffering and death. It must involve torture and humiliation. But he goes anyway. Today, tomorrow, and the next day, I will cast out demons, I will heal the sick, and I will continue to go to the city which rejects the prophets and rejects God. I will go anyway. And in all of this, we are invited in as the community of faith to that same question and that same dilemma. We are called, just like Jesus, to speak truth to power. So that when we see corruption, or when we see things that are potentially destructive to those we love and the world around us, we're to speak those out loud. And that can be a very scary thing. But notice also the follow-up which Jesus has. He answers the question, woe is over Jerusalem. And then, for one of very few times, especially in the New Testament, but even in the Bible overall. Jesus uses a feminine image to describe God and to describe his desire for us. He looks at the people, looks at the Pharisees, looks at all of the people surrounding him and says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, my people, how long have I wanted to gather you under my wing, as a hen does her young ones. And for us, I think the juxtaposition of both the challenge, the woe, and the metaphor of God's all-encompassing love and grace and generosity says that we are called to speak truth to power. We are called to be dangerous and to put our lives at risk. But at the same time, we don't do it alone. It's not something that's a solo venture. God says, I'm doing this not because I want things to change for change's sake. I'm doing this, I'm proclaiming this message. I give this good news to you, and by extension to us as the community of the faithful, because I want to gather you to myself. I want to be in relationship. I want the world to be a world which is filled with grace, love, reconciliation, and wholeness. And yeah, sometimes it is really scary. And sometimes we are going to be challenged. And sometimes people are not going to like what we have to say. But as we go through the journey of Lent, we're to recognize that in our own witnessing of God's kingdom, in our own recognition of who God is and what God does, we're called to go through the muck, to make our way towards Jerusalem, to make our way towards the truth, and to keep our ears, our eyes, and our hearts open along the way, and to speak words of truth when we feel that they are needed, because we are called as God's children to be that. But in the midst of the journey towards the city, in the midst of the persecution and the humiliation and the danger that's associated with speaking the truth, yes, there is the cross. Yes, there is pain. Yes, there is suffering and there is trial. But there's also, at the end of the tunnel, the empty tomb. The offer of new life and forgiveness. The offer to be in real relationship with the one who formed us from dust. And so, while we are called to be prophets, and while we are called to give witness to wonderful and yet dangerous things, remember, we are not alone in this. Our journey and its dark times that resemble Good Friday are always paired and always reflected and always brought to their fullness in Easter, in the reflection of new life, and in the sure knowledge that God will take us under his wing, giving us the gifts, the courage, and the love to do what we need to do.